Hey everyone, welcome to Exploring Health, Macro to Micro. I'm your host, Parker Condit. In this show, I interview experts from all areas of health, and this can be in areas that you would expect, like exercise, nutrition, and mental health, while other topics may be from areas where you're less familiar. Today's conversation probably falls into the latter category. And my guest today is Nelson ZêPequéno. Nelson is an artist and creator who uses gardening and plants as his art form. He's also the founder of the Black Men with Gardens Instagram page, which creates a safe space for Black men being multidimensional and being in touch with nature, plants, gardening, and the natural world. Our conversation focuses on the idea of regeneration, and there have been many conversations and episodes so far about regenerative farming, but this is more about taking those principles and applying them to life and how we live. Some of the highlights of this conversation are how a lack of resources can make you more creative and thus sustainable, why community organizers are so important to the health and well-being of community members, how reconnecting with nature is really reconnecting with yourself, and understanding how consumer behaviors, marketing, and purchasing power relates to climate change and our future. This was one of my favorite conversations so far, and I'm really grateful for Nelson coming on and spending as much time with me to chat and share his story and share his wisdom. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Nelson ZêPequéno. Nelson, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this conversation, and it's an honor to be on.
Yeah, so on this show, I've talked a lot about regenerative agriculture over the past probably month of shows, and it's kind of become more of a theme, and we're going to touch on that a bit today, probably more in terms of gardening and maybe flower arrangements, but I also want to tie that into sort of life and kind of using regeneration and regenerative as more of a overarching theme for this conversation. I think that'll be helpful for people. But I want to kind of start with how you first got introduced to plants. There's something on Instagram I saw where you said you got a plant because you moved to LA and you're kind of alone and you're depressed. So can you share how you first got into that? And then in that video, you end up saying like, oh, we became growth partners. I'm like, oh, this guy is a poet. I'd love to have him on. So we ended up getting connected, and it was, anyway, I'm really thankful that you're on and to have this conversation, but yeah, let's start there and see where the conversation goes.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I have, there's two stories about how I got into plants. That one would be the most recent story of my discovery for love of plants, because the first entry into plants was all based around cannabis and cannabis cultivation. That's what got me interested in horticulture. And through horticulture, I just really learned the science behind how to grow. But what got me into loving plants in general for plant care was, moving to Los Angeles alone, coming here to pursue my art form, and living alone in this studio apartment with nobody around me, not having my community just yet, and being in this really depressive state, that life forces us all into at certain points of time. And I remember, for the sake of art, I decided to buy one plant so I could learn to draw it, just so I could do a plant study, because I realized I couldn't imagine what a leaf looked like in my mind, enough so to be able to draw it on a piece of paper. So I went and bought a plant, and during that plant study, I realized, wow, these plants are actually beautiful, and let me go and get some more. And I started putting them on my windowsills, and I started hanging them up around me, and it just started to bring me so much joy, and it made me feel like I wasn't so alone. And I think that in and of itself helped me out of a really dark place, but then completely influenced the new direction I took my artwork in, and I've been pursuing for the past 9 years.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's just a way to sort of bring a bit of nature inside with you, because like cities are sort of this weird thing if you think about it from evolutionarily, like how we kind of got here to be that disconnected, like as disconnected as we are now. You live in Los Angeles, I'm in Scottsdale, Phoenix. It's kind of bizarre to be living in these sort of like made up environments and assuming our body's going to be okay with it. So I've kind of found that surrounding myself with greenery is a nice way to sort of mitigate I guess what would be some of the downside of living in an area like this.
Yeah, it's a great way. I mean, they don't incorporate natural spaces into large cities like mine, Los Angeles, like specifically. I live in downtown, and I mean, I've been to downtowns all around this country, and some downtowns do it better than most. But for mine, I have one large park around me that's kind of a mission to get to. My neighborhood has more concrete than it has greenery. So, living in this type of environment, I have to make a concerted effort to get to nature or bring it into my space, you know?
Hmm. Totally. So you kind of used plants to kind of get out of a depression. And I was saying right before this call, I had a similar thing where I tried to reconnect with nature when I was living in Colorado, slightly differently. It was actually a guy from LA, a guy named Jeff Waldron, I think. He started hanging up swings all around the city, just as a way to make people smile. And I was like, I'm like, that would make me smile. I'm an adult and I've been on the swing in probably a decade. So it's back in Colorado, probably almost 10 years ago at this point, but I just started crafting swings and hiking up in the mountains and just hanging them up on trails so people could swing in the middle of a hike. Yeah, I called it the Aspen Swing Project, and it was just a fun thing that was like very outwardly facing and forced me to get out in nature. And it totally just snapped me out of it, just gave me purpose.
Yeah, that sounds like an incredible project. I really like that, and I love public installations. It seems like at the core we understand that one of the only ways out of the depressive state that our constructed system, societies, work culture, and everything around us, it seems like one of the only ways out of that is to reclaim natural spaces, but also reclaim our sense of joy through play and through interacting with those natural spaces in joyful ways, like frolicking, you know? How many people get a chance to frolic nowadays, but you never really stop and think that could be the cure for these really heavy feelings that we deal with on a, daily basis.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny. So swinging is definitely one of those things that brings that to me. And then also I have an electric skateboard, and I feel like that's been one of the best purchases I've gotten in the past like 3 years. Just cause like the joy of having like wind in your face, it's such, nothing brings me like childlike, joy like riding that skateboard, which seems like such an absurd thing. But yeah,
Not at all.
you just try to find these things that you can sort of recapture, bits of that part of you, I guess.
Yeah, that's actually a huge part of this work, especially when it comes to Black men with gardens and just the image that seeing men working with flowers and plants has in itself is it's dismantling this idea of masculinity or what we identify with masculinity that haven't served us as men at all. So we associate it with our work, with our ability to do all types of stuff within these systemic structures, but we never identify with our ability to grow a garden or to go and play, to go and swing. And I think because we've put so much focus on the previous things that I mentioned, we see that the mental health crisis in our country has just been growing out of control. And again, part of this work is to reclaim those parts of who we are and to reimagine what it is for us to be men in this society and in this system.
Yeah. So you mentioned Black Men in the Gardens, which is definitely something we want to spend some time on later. I want to circle back to that. Just on the idea of mental health, anytime this comes up and just given our current environment, I always try to point out, have you read any work by Gabor Mate?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay. He wrote his most recent book. I think it's called The Myth of Normal. He advocates, he's a medical doctor, but does a lot in the like mental health side of things. And he advocates for the idea that a lot of the responses of what we're seeing is completely normal to the circumstances we're living in, as opposed to people thinking like, oh, I'm abnormal for having this condition or this sort of disease state or this response. And it's like, it's a very normal response to the environment that we're currently in. So I always try to bring that up. I do want to get more of your background though. Like, can you just share with people, you touched on horticulture, but like, what do you do exactly? Cause I've spent a lot of time on your Instagram. I'm like,
Yeah.
there's a lot here. I know you travel quite a bit. You speak on panels. You do some work with climate. Can you just give me a brief overview of what you do in a sense?
Yeah, my Instagram is dedicated to my artwork, and my artwork is actually something that I do personally. Professionally, I've been working in experiential marketing for the past 7, 8 years now. Right now I work as a creative producer, a project manager, sometimes set designer. That where I started was set design or scenic design, just building environments for TV, film productions, commercial, and specifically events. Just pretty much building cool stuff that other people get to engage with and take photos in front of. Uh, I do that professionally because that allows me to use my art form in a practical, professional way that allows me to sustain myself, as an adult in this system where I have to pay rent and pay bills, and but a lot of my core motivation, my core principles, my driving motivation is sustainable design. It's about bringing sustainability to my industry, which is heavily, 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 you know, we, I don't know if you've ever seen the end of a production, whether it's like a TV show or commercial or an event, but literally they just wheel in huge dumpsters and trash everything that we spent weeks building up. So for me, it's all about bringing sustainability. It's about baking sustainability into that production practice so that we can, obviously lower our footprint. But, you know, when I speak to the executives on these things. It's about, increasing our bottom line. If we're not trashing everything, we're able to reuse these scenic assets and a different activation, then obviously we're saving money. So essentially, I work to bring sustainability into my industry, as well as advocate for it on a communal, on a social level. Where yes, I'll do panels and talk about sustainable creativity, because I truly believe that when we are looking at all the issues that we're facing due to um, climate change and ecological loss and all of these different issues that we're facing, it's going to take extreme amounts of creativity to innovate our way out of these problems that we've been handed down. And all of that innovation can't just be, let's build a brand new product. We actually have to think super creative, think outside of the box. So to get there, we have to empower creative thinking and empower the next generation of people to dive into their creativity, understanding that they have a unique perspective that's going to allow them to see an issue from a different way. And all of these different unique perspectives brought together is ultimately what's going to bring us out of the place we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there's some smart person who said you can't use the same line of thinking to, like, whatever the problem is, whatever line of thinking you use to produce that problem, you can't use the same line of thinking to find the solutions. It might have been
Exactly.
Einstein, or you probably, there's some, I just butchered some quote, but anyway. Um, so have you always been this involved and this kind of proactive in your thinking around sustainability, or was this sort of a slow shift? How did you get to basically where you are today from a mindset standpoint?
Yeah. I feel like working class people have understood the same thing that the intellectual class has understood, and we just go about it from different perspectives. Um, every working class family that I've ever known has to think super creative about how they sustain themselves. Uh, Me growing up, I didn't have a budget for art supplies. So I had to get creative with the things I had around me. And that deeply informed my art practice now, where it's like, yes, if I look at my lack of access as a barrier, then I'll never be able to be an artist. But if I look at my lack of access and focus on the things that I have around me to create value in my life, then it's unlimited. The potential is unlimited. So working class families have been dealing with this for generations, for eons at this point. And it requires a certain level of creativity to be able to sustain yourself in a system like this that's constantly devolving in a sense, whether it's through inflation or whether it's through job market loss, all these different things. We have to find ways to sustain ourselves. And for me, being an artist in general, that informed my creativity. That informed my art form. Um, but then ultimately led me to think about it, yes, on a more intellectual level, where it's like, okay, well, so then what's the sciences behind this? What's the applications behind this on a grand scale? And but be able to bridge that gap in a way where it's like, again, like some people, once they hear about sustainable doctrines that you might learn in college, they're actually like, oh no, my grandparents used to do that when I was younger. We never let a container of butter go in the trash. Like that became the container for something else. Or like I've been wearing my great grandparents' pants because, or we reuse paper towels. We don't just throw things away and it's like, oh well, that's sustainability, right? But we're doing it out of necessity. And unfortunately, more and more of us are going to be pushed into doing it out of necessity unless we start getting creative about finding solutions.
Yeah, I worked in marketing much earlier in my career. And again, I'm going to butcher someone else's quote saying, like, if you need to get good results from your marketing department, cut their budget in half. Because you're going to force them to get really creative. It's like you can't just throw money at the problem anymore. You need to get creative with what you have.
Yes,
And yeah,
exactly.
you do much more outside the box thinking, if you will. It's not just a bunch of ad buys on Instagram and Facebook anymore.
Yeah, it's funny, that necessity, the necessity and the lack of accessibility. Again, like it can be viewed as a barrier, it can be viewed as something that's working against you, or it can be used as something to work with. And ultimately, it takes somebody creative to see it in the latter form.
Hmm. So where did you move from and what brought you to LA?
Uh, I was born originally in Accra, Ghana. I moved from Accra to New Jersey, and from New Jersey to Cincinnati, Ohio, where I spent the majority of my adolescence. Um, from Cincinnati, I moved to Los Angeles, California about 9 years ago. I was actually just looking at a post that I made in this again, this like depressive state in this city and finding myself in the city in this state that seemed to be stomping on my creative aspirations. And I remember I was just viewing this post where I was saying something about like, I've always put other people's goals ahead of mine as a way of escaping failure. Um, and with that being the case, I'm leaving to Los Angeles to pursue what I feel like I need to pursue for myself. And it was a mind f to look at that post and be like, damn, where was I at mentally when that happened? And but then also to be able to look and say, well, I've been doing what I set out to do, and I have those days where I feel like I could be doing more. I'm actually, proud of where my journey's taken me.
So I grew up in New Jersey as well, originally. I think people who create content somewhat consistently, once you've done it for a long enough time, you really see the value in being able to look back on it and you're like, oh, this is a very good visual diary of where I was and what I was thinking, which, can kind of make you cringe at moments, but also it can be very helpful to look back and be like, all right, well, that's where I was in the world. And you can just use that as these benchmarks to look back. My partner very recently just started a YouTube channel, and you probably know the fear of like putting yourself out there at first. And I'm like, if nothing else, just use this as a benchmark to kind of chronicle where you were at the time. And it's a great way to relieve some of the pressure from getting started. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing kind of the moments before you had moved to LA. But you
Yeah.
feel like you have been accomplishing what you wanted to?
Yeah, I gotta come outside of myself and say yes. It's really dope to say yes, because again, like I'll still wake up and I'll be like, well, I'm still struggling in these aspects, and I still don't have this figured out. But it's nice to be able to know that I'm actually working, doing the things that that I want to do. And I'm privileged enough to be able to use my art form to create a living, but then ultimately get to connect with more people like you.
Yeah, it's certainly a privilege to be in this position. Like being able to sit and have these conversations is such a pleasure for me. Not only, yeah, just to be able to connect with great people in the world, but it's also like I get to learn so much and to be able to do this and facilitate conversations and share it and hopefully spread the message. It's like what a joy to be in this position. It's really absurd.
Yeah, it's a blessing.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit more about the horticulture? Like, what was your educational background that kind of got you so interested in horticulture?
For me, everything has been self-started. Um, in general, when it came to systemic education, structured work, I just didn't fit in. So I had to find a way to build something sustainable for myself. And it's got to be self motivated for it to be sustainable for me. So with horticulture, the motivation was to be able to have weed and not have to pay a lot of money for it. So I studied the Grow Bible by Jorge Cervantes and learned everything I could from every single resource that was available at the time, to really be able to cultivate cannabis. Um, and I did that for a couple of years successfully, cultivating cannabis in Ohio during the time it was extremely illegal to do so. Um, and that in and of itself taught me horticulture, but I never really applied it again to like that, like, oh, well, I can, with this thing that I just learned, I can actually grow a farm now of other things.
Yeah. You didn't realize the skill set you had on hand.
Yeah, I didn't realize. But it did give me an appreciation for plants in general, because part of cannabis cultivation is during the end, right before you harvest, you actually spend a large amount of time with magnifying glasses studying trichomes. So we're looking for different variation in the color of these trichomes that will signify to us that this plant is ready to harvest. And just spending hours looking at plants under a microscope, like you start to really appreciate, like it was some of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen, just studying trichomes. Um, and that just made me interested in plants in general. And fortunately, during that time where I was switching over when I moved to Los Angeles, cannabis is plentiful here, so I didn't have to grow it myself. Plus, I didn't have the space anymore. So I think that appreciation of plants just really crossed over into, an overall appreciation for plants, and then the horticulture knowledge allowed me to keep my plants alive. I still lose one or two every once in a while, but I have plants that have been rocking with me for years now at this point, and are going to continue to.
Do you have any advice for people who are a little bit scared to start, even with a house plant? They like, I've killed so many house plants, I just can't keep them alive. Do you have any advice for people like that? Which was, me a few years ago.
Yeah, I say just get flowers. Get fresh cut flowers every week and do a new bouquet in a vase, and just bring some type of natural element into your space. It's going to beautify your space. It's going to make you feel good when you see it. You can, when you arrange it in the vase, you're touching it, you're getting those, mental, that grounding effect of even just working with plants. That's the main thing I recommend, because ultimately, again, like we've been talking about, these systems that have us so down in a lot of ways, and it's that same system that's got you killing plants. None of us have time to take care of a plant. Like it's a lot. Like it requires a lot, and instead of, I feel like, people that understand the benefits of plant care are quick to push people into trying to get that benefit, without understanding that if you push somebody into trying to get that benefit and they spend a lot of money on plants and then they end up killing the plants, then ultimately they didn't just get any benefit. They didn't get any mental health benefit. It might even be the adverse, where it's like you just wasted money and you're upset because you just killed this plant. So for me, I would just encourage people to first just get into buying themselves flowers, taking care of themselves in that way, and then ultimately you can start to learn, you'll have more time to spend reading, learning about specific plants, because I think a greater study needs to be done. For me, specifically, I live in SoCal, so I purposely chose plants that already thrive in the environment that I live in. That takes so much work out of it. I don't have to worry about keeping these succulents alive because they're drought tolerant. So it's, oh, okay, actually, I can get some cacti or some things like that. And when you start just even learning and paying attention to your own environment, you'll understand what can come into your environment and thrive with you. If you live in a place like Ohio, where for 6 months out of the year, it's going to be gray, and then it's going to get super cold. But not only does it get super cold, that means you're going to have to blast the heat in your home, which is going to drop the humidity and make it hot. You need to understand these things to really know what type of plant's going to thrive in that environment with you. So I think it's about looking at it holistically. While you're looking at it holistically, just buy yourself flowers and enjoy the splash of color that they bring and joy that they'll bring you as well.
Yeah, you're echoing a handful of the things that I had Greg Peterson on the show. He's an urban farmer, and I was like, what am I going to do? Because he was basically the one who inspired me to start growing food out on the patio. And I was like, what should I do to not kill these plants? And he goes, most people go to Home Depot and they buy a tomato plant and they plop it in, and they don't pay attention to what zone they're in, what time of the year they're planting it. He's like, if you just plant something that's made for your zone and plant it around the right time of the year, whether you're going from seed or you're going from transplant. And by the way, there's a PDF of this, at least for Arizona, that I can share with people if you're interested. He's like, if you just plant it at the right time of the year, you're going to have a much higher level of success. He goes, he's like, you could have the greenest thumb you want, but if you plant stuff that's not made for that zone at the wrong time of the year, you're working against nature. And that's kind of the theme of like regenerative, and so much of what I've been learning more about. It's like, as far as how we grow food in this country, we just do things in the stupidest way possible because we can. Like, we have the resources and the money to just throw at problems in this country, and that's what we do instead of just working with how things naturally work in the world. You were speaking before about kind of the beauty of plants, and I think it was something that I had lost for a long time, where like I learned about plants in school because it's just part of primary education and like how plants grow. But I saw a video of it in like a glass with the side, so you could see a seed being planted and then it being watered and it growing and sprouting. And I was like, this is like the greatest magic trick, because that's going to grow and create food, and then you can take a seed from that food and replant it, and it's going to create more. I'm like, it's like the world's greatest pyramid scheme. And we're doing it all wrong. Like, nature just has this beautiful way for us to produce food, and we're just doing it not that way.
Yeah,
Miraculously.
That's that awakening moment that everybody has when they're subjected and when they finally do get their hands on plants or do get the ability to see how nature works in and of itself. We start to realize that it's probably one of the greatest crimes committed against all of us, is that miseducation and that disconnect from where we come from to such an extent that now only 1% of the people in this country control the overall or the overwhelming majority of the food that we eat. But it can be as simple as all of us growing the foods that we eat. It can be as simple, and it's for a reason. Obviously, we can't be growing food and working in their factories at the same time, right? So it's like, okay, well, once we do go through that awakening and we do start to learn and take those type of things into account, then we start to recreate those systems in ways that benefit us and that don't leave us all depressed and disconnected from where we come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think plants are a great way to sort of introduce people to that in a less direct way, where you have to start caring for something outside of yourself, which I think is a big issue here, where everyone's just like kind of huddled up with their stuff, the kind of me. But if you have a few plants or you start growing some food, oftentimes you have too much of that one thing and you can't use enough of it, and you start giving it away. And then it's I think it's like this little gateway drug into making people care more about other people.
Yes, of course. One of the benefits, one of those things about gardening, especially for me as a man, is that gardening aids in the recovery of emotional connection in and of itself, and that leads then to more community care. Once we start caring about things outside of work, outside of bills, outside of all of the things that have been built up here, we start caring more about nature and about community. We start to see better effects just on the mental, spiritual, emotional, societal level. And I'm happy to see so many men coming back to that because we, as men, we rarely have these places where we can show that level of care. It's always hidden. It's hidden from society in general, and it's controlled and it's only shared with the people closest to us behind closed doors, and never let anybody else see. You have to always maintain this facade of this masculine identity in this way. But when you see a man out working and caring for plants and teaching his kids or other children how to care for plants and caring for community by providing them with produce that he cared for and brought to them, it's such a beautiful thing to behold, and it's such a beautiful thing to be a part of. I'm telling you, any any man that does this feels it on such a molecular level, and it's completely transformative in and of itself. You mentioned watching that seed grow. I view men in today's society as that seed that's been buried under the soil, and that soil is the rigid enforcement of, let's say, patriarchy. And when watching that seed grow and sprout through is watching that transformation of somebody get in touch with their caring side, with their community side, with their, supportive side, and redefine everything else that was dictated for us to be in general.
Yeah, it's hard to break through that resistance though, because there's a lot of pressure working against that.
Oh yeah.
So I guess that segues nicely into like, is that why you started Black Men with Gardens?
Yeah. That's a huge reasoning behind it. At the core of Black Men with Gardens is about reclaiming narrative. One of the easiest ways to dehumanize people or dehumanize communities is to show them in specific ways. You notice that the people that are afforded humanity in today's society are allowed to be three-dimensional. We see them care for family. We see them in the garden. We see them as part of community. But the others are only shown in these one-dimensional ways of, oh, well, I'd hate to even dive into the stereotypes that they provided for us. But in general, for me and my community specifically, at the time where I created Black Men with Gardens, you were more likely to see a video or photo of a Black man in some type of negative interaction with police or with the system than you were to see a photo or a video of a Black man caring for plants. Uh, and that didn't sit right with me. It was during a time where I was looking for inspiration. I was looking for anything that could help me on my journey. When I came here, I was alone. I didn't know what to do. I started to get into plants, but I still don't know what to do with that. I don't, everybody that I was learning about plant care from didn't look like me. And I mean, growing up, we become used to that. But obviously, I still want to search for examples of ways to live that match my experience, and it's impossible to find that. So I started to create it myself. Obviously, because of the type of artist I am in general, it's like there isn't that many examples. It's all about creating a new visual. Cool. I'm going to take on this specific task myself and not rely on anybody else to provide that narrative or that representation for me. Uh, and also, what I can do is search harder for that representation and create a platform that is committed solely to increasing and facilitating, holding space for that community and sharing that community again with us, holding up a mirror for us and creating a safe space where we can come and be ourselves and see us for who we are. And it's incredible. Like the Black Men with Gardens hashtag now has more than 20,000 posts.
That's
Like
amazing.
when I started, if you search Black Men with Gardens, there was 100.
Yeah,
There
you get that sign less than 100. When you're trying to search.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It might even say on Instagram, it might even say 100 plus, but then you click on it, and you scroll, and you get like 50, and then it
Yeah.
just like taps out. Um, so it's been great to see that many, Black men or men in my community feel more comfortable sharing that side of who they are.
Yeah.
Uh, and each representation, each photo that gets posted, each video that gets posted counteracts that negative representation that someone else decided that they were going to share about our experience in an effort to to keep us one dimensional.
How long ago did you start that?
I started that page in 2017.
Okay. So
Yeah.
7 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think what's the most surprising thing you've learned from sort of facilitating and garnering that space?
I think the most surprising thing I've learned is that it's who the F we are. It's who we are. And it's crazy because growing up as a Black man in America, everybody, we're so deeply influenced by media in general. And again, not having the media growing up that like Black men work with flowers, Black men garden. Um, it was surprising to me to see that, hold on, like that's what the majority of us are spending our weekend doing. That's what the majority of us care to do. We want to be out of nature. You know, we want to produce for our families. We are these people already. Um, and I can share that, even as a Black man, it surprised me because again, I was just as much a victim to the lack of representation that everyone else is in this country. One of the most surprising messages I've ever gotten on the page was I got a message from an older white lady that told me that because of the page and because of the images that she was able to see on the page, she was less likely to think that the Black man walking behind her was going to rob her and more likely to think that he was just on his way to like the farmer's market or something. And like it's like a stab in the gut, but then it's kind of uplifting a little bit because I'm like, I understand why you would think that if the only videos you see of us are being arrested, being brutalized by police, whatever it is, um, then it matters more. It matters just as much that you're able to see who we are on a human level and be able to use that information to form your perspectives about us because perspective is reality to a sense. And because of the narratives that were portrayed about us and the perspectives that it created, our experiences have been negatively impacted for generations. And our work and the work of a lot of people are changing those perspectives. I mean, it's a burden to have to do that, but we're changing those perspectives and redefining our experience along the way.
Yeah. The perceptions that are portrayed, they kind of come across everywhere. I got to pause for a second. I'm getting a little feedback. Yeah, it sounds better now. Yeah, I think it was just lagging for a second. So I'll just start over. Yeah, so like the perceptions that are put out there, they get, they affect everyone, right? And you kind of shared that story of that older white lady. And then it was I think it's one of your pinned stories on your Instagram. It's like a roundtable discussion. And you were talking about how there's a negative connotation for Black people working the land. And you were kind of advocating for the fact that it can be, if we reframe it and kind of change that conversation, shift it to an empowering position, which like once I read it or like listened to you say that, I was like 100%, I totally get that. But it was something I hadn't consciously thought of, and it had to be put in front of my face, like as embarrassing as it is to admit. But yeah, so I think it's important, hopefully for me to have these conversations. So other like white people listening be like, you need to acknowledge like these are the perceptions that are out there, and we all need to kind of work to help shift them, hopefully in a better direction.
Definitely. That's 100% true. It's the perceptions of one thing, but like you just mentioned, there's trauma associated with this type of work as well. And, trauma informed agriculture seeks to address these issues in the realm of agriculture. Um, and it's been a barrier working within my community to we don't want to intrinsically or maybe based off of our experience we don't want to go out into the woods. There's trauma there. We don't want to there's trauma there in our past experiences, but then even the disconnect through redlining, the lack of access to natural green spaces, who does it all belong to? It's not us. So how can we have these experiences, right? And when you grow up not having these experiences, not having the access to it, you start to develop fears around it. I was afraid of frogs for a really long time just because I never was in an environment that had frogs. So I never touched them growing up. I never, played with them or anything like that. And because of that, I just had this unconscious fear of frogs. I'm like, I don't want to touch that thing. It's slimy. This thing is a part of nature. And if I was had any opportunity to be around them growing up, I wouldn't have this unconscious fear of it. And what for me personally, what that unconscious fear represented to myself was an unconscious fear of nature. And I had to deeply address that. And I'm still addressing that because I'm still afraid of butterflies. I'm like, of all these things. And so there's trauma, there's a lot of work to be done in our community. And again, it begins by just even getting us to touch plants, to touch grass, to go hiking, to go camping. And it evolves more and more. And then next thing you know, people are talking about homesteading.
Yeah. Um, a lot of the conversations I've had on this show around health and healthcare, one of the big question marks is always social determinants of health, which is the aspects of health that you cannot directly control, right? It's not your step count. It's not the medical doctor you see. It's not how much you exercise, what you eat. Is there access to groceries within walking distance if you live in a city and you should be able to walk there? It's not a 20-minute bus ride. Are there access to green spaces? And a lot of these are deeply rooted in like systemic racist policy and infrastructure problems. And through most of the healthcare professionals that I've spoken to, there's never that acknowledgement. It's always like we're working on, not to say it's like a weekend seminar, but that's how like the solutions being presented kind of feel from the healthcare side. And it's so frustrating. I mean, not even to be like personally affected by it, but just to like have these conversations, like we're not even having the right conversation. We're refusing the acknowledgement of the conversation. And just to give people a concrete example of this, Robert Moses was the parks commissioner. He was a very powerful figure in the 1920s through the 1950s in New York City. But he created about 400 parks in New York City. And I think only 4 of them were in predominantly minority neighborhoods. So like when you talk about access to green spaces, it's like these were decisions that were made 80 to 100 years ago. It's like those still exist. Like that infrastructure is still there. So it's a much broader conversation around these things that needs to happen. And it can't just be like, how do we do sensitivity training for doctors? Like cultural sensitivity training for doctors. Yeah, that's important. But there's bigger issues at play. So anyway, I wanted to try to tie this into health and healthcare as the theme of the show. But
yeah, no, it's all associated and deeply rooted or connecting back to health, mental and physical. Whether it comes, one thing I think about is when we work with children and we teach them how to grow their own food. Anybody that's done that work notices just how much more children are interested in eating fruits and vegetables when they've seen how it's grown or when they've actively participated in growing it. So when you're so far disconnected from it, not only do you not have any interest in it, but they make other things that are more addicting, uh, and that are more readily, and that stuff happens to be more readily accessible, like fast food. And so when we think about how the deeper physical, mental health effects that has on a long term, it's unfortunate because my community is being impacted by, you know, physical being impacted by health issues at an earlier age now due to just diet in general. We're and I think it's almost every community in America now. It's like starting to get colon cancers earlier, starting to have liver disease earlier. Um, and my little sister just passed away from kidney liver failure. My
I'm really
little sister.
sorry to hear that.
I appreciate that. And one thing the pastor said, the pastor that's at the funeral, he's like 80 years old. And he's the one that's mentioned the fact that, like, why are children dying from these things that in my day, it was the oldest people that were suffering from? And we don't realize how connected that is to our disconnection from nature in general. And by being disconnected from nature, we're susceptible to so many horrible things that, again, the 1% of people producing the foods that we eat now are producing it and feeding to us because it's all that's available.
Yeah. Where's it going to go with that? Oh, I feel like also, like, you can look at these individual aspects of health, exercise, nutrition, whatever you want. And I think those have been largely isolated from the community aspect. I think you need to eat so well now, and you need to be so strong, and you need to get so much sleep now, all independently, because the lack of community is so prominent. Where it's like you have to be like the strongest version of an individual possible because there's nothing backing you up. In the way that community has largely been degraded, I think a lot of those health aspects can probably be a little bit more lax if the community is a lot stronger. And that's something I've changed my tune on a lot, probably over the past 5 or 6 years, where I was like, here's the data. It's empirical. Like, if you have a lot of muscle mass, you're going to live longer. You need to get 7 to 9 hours of sleep because that's what the data says. I'm like, you can probably buffer a lot of this stuff if you have a really strong community and you don't feel like you're solely responsible for everything that comes your way in life. And you can sort of disperse that amongst a strong community. I want to kind of parlay that into the fact that you seem like a good community organizer. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's part of the work that I do. It's probably one of the biggest parts of the work that I do is community organizing.
What can people do to become more active or become better participants in the community?
That's a great question. And I think I think about this a lot as well because, yeah, I'm a community organizer, but I'm also a participant.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of goes back to what you're saying. It seemed like for a time there that the majority of solutions that were handed down to us is to become the best individual that we can be. All within the comfort of our own home, never having to interact with anybody else, just do the best you can do for yourself. And that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. The best way is to just participate, is to go out and to seek community through different modalities. And so with the work that I do, I'm trying to find ways of what exactly that can look like because it's something that we're all struggling with. It sucks that it doesn't suck. I'll say this, that there are a lot of community that are out there that you can participate in. Unfortunately, that requires resources on the community organizers for the community organizers' efforts. So sometimes there's always going to be a paywall. So it's going to affect the people with the least amount of resources, right? But the people with the least amount of resources might need it the most. So it's about actively just going outside, being out in green, natural spaces, finding communities that are also engaged in doing that, and being open and honest with your communication with them to be able to interact and to engage with them. Because I know a bunch of organizations here in the city. I'm going on a group camping trip this weekend and then another one next weekend. Just so I love camping by myself, but I realize like I need to go and do things with other people right now because I'm also going through a lot of stuff and I can't just therapize myself. I can't just fix this stuff in my own echo chamber. Actually, I just need to go and be in community doing the things that I've found are, are fun to me. So, like you said earlier, you like skating. It's about joining a skate club. you know, what I love about the huge cities now too is that like you could go and take skating lessons, and that's going to put you around other people that are just as equally excited about skating that you can build community with. Whether it's rock climbing, camping, all of these communities are opening up. So, okay, I think I got it now. If you want to be a better participant, identify what brings you joy, and then go outside and find other people that enjoy the same things. So for me, I love plant care. I love floristry. So I went and found um, floral workshops. I facilitate them, but I also attend them because I get to learn something more about floristry. I get to work with plants, and I get to take home a beautiful bouquet at the end of the class. Right. I love camping, so I'm going to go on a group camping trip, and the activity is going to bring me joy in and of itself. But then I'm going to get to meet new people. I'm going to get to interact with these people and possibly make new friends, and come outside of myself. It's such a it's such a slap in the face to the systems of isolation that they created for us to get back outside, enjoying ourselves and enjoying ourselves with other people that are interested in doing the same thing. And I say if you're facing a scenario where you believe you don't have the resources to engage with these type of communities, I can tell you as a community organizer myself, if you're earnest in your communication with community organizers about where you are and your what your ability, but also your interest and enthusiasm and being a part of these things, I don't think there's a single community organizer who's going to be like, well, actually, I still need that bread. Like, nah, they're gonna invite you in. I'm telling you, they're going to invite you in. So communicate earnestly and realize like that's part of being a part of a community, you know? We're all going to support each other in every single way. And that goes both ways for the organizers and the participants.
Yeah, it's great advice. I hope you see some butterflies on your camping trips to help with the exposure therapy.
I hope I do, on one of my last group camping trips, it was dope because there were people that weren't afraid of frogs, so they're catching them and they're holding them, giving me the ability to kind of just like pet them, get kind of exposure therapy, and I'm like breaking it down, and it's great. It brought me a lot of joy, even though I'm like wincing a little bit, like I don't know, but um, overall, I think this that these taking these routes is the path to self actualization. We're not going to self actualize in our home alone. We're not going to self actualize while we're at work, especially in the work culture that we have now that actually says, hold on, don't build emotional connection to the people you work with. Actually, create a barrier between that and all these. We're not going to reach it through those
Yeah.
modalities.
Make sure you have your corporate persona.
Yeah, your corporate persona, and like, we're not going to reach self actualization through that. And we're not going to recover our emotional connections through isolation, you know?
Yeah, that's great advice. I do want to ask you a little bit more about your workshops. So, I've seen some of the results of them, but can you share, I guess maybe what was the first workshop you did? And I'd love to hear sort of how they've evolved over time and what you really want to create with this. Obviously, there's a trying to build community and build something beautiful by the end of it. But how did you start with workshops and where do you want to take them in the future?
I got to give credit to Hugh Augustine. He's actually a rapper here in LA. It's like a huge time rapper. He's amazing, extremely talented. Out of nowhere one day, he just hit me up and he said, "Hey, we're throwing this event. You want to lead a workshop?" I had never done it before. This was like in maybe 2018 or something, right after I had just got into making like plant art. It was right after that, and I created Black North Gardens. He might have found me through Black North Gardens. I don't know how he found me, but he hit me up and he's like, "Hey, we're doing this like event, and there's going to be other artists kind of leading these things. Do you want to come in and do a plant workshop?" And I said, "Yeah." I didn't know how to price it. I didn't know. I knew where to get the material, but I didn't know how I was going to lead it. And there ended up being maybe like 150 people there or something like that. It
Oh,
was
a nice, easy one to start with.
right. It was
Low
huge.
pressure.
But I'll never forget how happy everyone was. Like how much people just enjoyed. They were coming and picking their plants. And I created a station where it's like the way I do my workshops now, it's almost like a buffet of creativity where we have your plants, we have the mediums you can use. And because my art form has been rooted in my unique interest in specific things and just, okay, what do I have around me? How can I use this and this together? And that unique perspective each individual has. And my workshop practice has become a way of engaging people's ability to depend on their unique perspectives to create value in their life. So during that, I just had a buffet of material, flowers, material that you could use to create your own planter. And it was incredible to see people come like, what plant's this? Oh, this sticks out to me, or this sticks out to me. I'm gonna make this. Oh, I got this idea. And it was incredible to just see people going through that process. I had the best freaking time. It was incredible. I still have friendships from that first workshop
Oh, it's
to
amazing.
this day now. That I built, including Hugh, who I respect and love for even giving me the opportunity, because you know, that gave me an idea of it's hard to be an artist. I'm telling you,
Sure.
it's hard to be an artist that's like building their own form of work. I don't clock in and somebody tells me like, "Hey, this is what you're gonna do today." Like, I have to figure it out every
Mhm.
single freaking day.
It's tiring, right?
It's freaking tiring. I have to figure it out every day, and it's hard to create something that's sustainable. Okay, what can I do on a recurring basis? Now you can't buy my art. Like right now, at the current moment, you can't buy my art. I don't want to just sustain myself by selling things to people. You
Mhm.
know, if I could sustain myself by providing an experience that teaches somebody something, that allows them to engage with their creativity, that helps them experiment and discover new parts of themselves, and also make friends with people in the community that are interested in the same thing, like sign me up all day long. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was thinking about it the other day. People say that being an artist, it's like on the chart of like most meaningful careers, like artists is at the bottom. Like people try to paint artists, no pun intended, try to paint artists as like this like useless to society job. Like it's this career that like it doesn't generate any benefit for society in some way. But I'm like, yeah, you guys say that, but has your job put a smile on somebody's spirit? Has your job really had somebody walking away where they're just like excited to be alive and to do something that brings them joy? Like, I've seen that. I've seen people walk out of my workshops with new friends. I've seen people walk out of my workshop looking at this thing they just created, like, I did not know I had this inside of me. And I wonder what else is inside of me that I could bring to life. And that's all I need. That's it. That's the goal. Yeah.
I think it really depends on what metrics you're measuring by.
Right.
Yeah. By capital output, yeah, artists probably aren't very high on that list. But I've always thought of how to describe this. The the words that our language contains, I feel like aren't really well equipped for describing like the vastness and the deepness of life. And because they always seem inadequate, especially if you're not well equipped to sort of craft the words in the right way. But the artists are the closest that we get to that. They're the closest at expressing kind of the truth of life and the full meaning of life. Um, and like they do their best at capturing that in a way that we can all connect with, right? Whether it's through music or through floral arrangements or whatever it might be. Everyone has their own avenue that they're going to connect with more so than others. But yeah, so I think it really depends on what metric you're measuring by to where artists are gonna fall on that list. So I
Very
think
well said.
it can be very high on the list if you're looking at a different metric.
Yeah, if we're looking at the joy metric, It's interesting. A study was just released, I believe, this year that showed that, people talk about the cure for depression, and on the scale of things you could do to cure depression, medication, it didn't even make like top 5, right? But the other things that they tell you to do, like physical exercise, oh, just go and work out.
Mhm.
That wasn't at the very top either. You know what was the number one thing to cure depression? Dancing.
Yep, I believe
It's
that.
dancing. So how important is music? That it
Right.
might be one of the most important things in this world, you know? But
Yep.
if we're just thinking about, you know, money, then we might not push people to create music. We might not push people to dance. But if we're thinking about having a well-adjusted society and communities and families and people, then like maybe we need to prioritize other things, you know?
Hmm.
I'm gonna dance after this podcast.
That's that's good. I highly encourage you to. Um, you mentioned, I think you kind of danced around it a few times in this. You talked about interaction and exposure. So you obviously do a very good job at like being able to change people's minds and be able to influence people, whether overtly or not. How'd you kind of come to the idea or the combination of using interaction and exposure to teach people?
I think it's because it's the only way I learn. Like I was saying earlier, when it comes to like sit down, read this book, take instruction, memorize, and repeat it on this thing, it's like n- that's not the best way of learning for me specifically. And that might be the case for a lot of other people in this world. Not saying everybody, but like everybody learns differently. So I think that my practice in and of itself is to teach people that maybe learn like me. But I think maybe at the core, I believe that it is the core of learning in and of itself is that it has to be interactive, it has to be experiential, um, and it has to be through stories. Because again, we're just dealing with what these systems, these structures that were set into place during the Industrial Revolution. But like the way that people learned up until that point was through storytelling. And I'm talking about every indigenous culture across the world passes lessons, morals, ethics, everything through stories, first and foremost. Um, and then it's through the experiential, it's through learning, where apprenticeship was the biggest was the biggest mechanism for learning a trade, a skill, a subject, all the way up until again the factory style schooling system that we developed so that Henry Ford could have more people in his factories. Literally, it comes specifically from that. Like, hey, I need more people in my factories. We need to develop this system that gets more people into them, and that flies in the face of who we are as humans. And I'm just trying to connect with who we are. I'm trying to connect with nature.
So when it comes to climate and sustainability, given the idea of like interaction and exposure, it, it's hard to imagine the amount of people who are still not kind of on board to the level that I think should be. Um, but okay, like try to
Yeah,
withhold judgment there. But especially in the US, you can really isolate yourself from the effects of this, right? We're largely disconnected, so we don't have that interaction and exposure necessarily.
right.
How, because like if people can just go to the places where they're being affected so significantly, it's impossible to deny it. But
Right.
without flying people there, like, do you have any approach towards changing minds in that perspective when people are like, it's not getting any warmer where I live and they're not seeing the direct effects of it?
I think it's instead of trying to force individuals to really take on the brunt of the work that needs to be done to mitigate climate change and other issues, we have to really strip away at the structures, the systems in place that have been the overwhelming contributors to the negative effects that we're facing. You know, the idea of like the individual carbon footprint and all those things were meant to throw all of that burden back onto our shoulders. And each of us decided at a specific point in time, like, I'm not going to use a plastic straw anymore. California, you had to pay extra for plastic bags, which is reduced plastic, all that stuff. But like, there's still people building, um, oil refineries on the Gulf Coast. Or like, if we're doing this work and these systems that are actually having the worst impact aren't doing anything, then it doesn't matter what I can get the individual to do. Um, so I think that the fight is with the system in general, is with the corporations that benefit from um, destroying our environments. And if we keep the focus there while we embolden people's creativity and exposure to nature in general, then I think it's a fight that we will win. Um, it's interesting that surfers, free divers, um, people that live near or work in the ocean, they are stewards of that environment by default. They love the reef. They love the coral reef. So when they witness bleaching of their favorite reef that they used to love diving down and seeing all of the diverse marine life, they are enraged by it. So again, if we get people out in nature and we get people appreciating nature in general, they're going to by default become stewards. They're going to by default become advocates when they start to see the negative effects that these industries are having on their favorite environments, you know?
Yeah. So that comes back to kind of the exposure piece of it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I was in the same camp for a long time where I was like, I know that 70% of carbon emitted comes from like 50 companies or something like that. So I was like, why am I going to change my behavior? But I've since realized I'm like, it's not an all or nothing proposition. And the more I do it individually, the more my financial decisions are influenced as well. So that's kind of why I was asking, where I was like, the more conscious I become of this, and to be clear, it's not my doing, it was my partner shoving lots of information in my face repeatedly, being like, you need to take this seriously. I could be very bullheaded. So kudos to her for finally getting through to me. But the more I paid attention to it, now I'm shifting my financial decisions away from those companies and those organizations that are doing most of the polluting. And without being a deeply political person, not in that I don't care, not it's just that I don't really know how to influence it in a meaningful way. The most influence I feel like I can have is at using my wallet essentially by not pushing dollars towards those organizations anymore. So that's the only reason I still think educating and changing minds at the individual level is still very important.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned that you worked in marketing, and and I work in experiential marketing, the sole purpose for marketing was to get us to buy the stuff that they were producing, right? That's how our whole industry came about. They started producing the stuff that was having really harmful effects on our environment, and then they came up with marketers to be like, now sell it to them. So all we can do is unravel that. All we can do is, okay, well, at an individual level, we're not buying this stuff anymore. On a marketing level, you can't market it to us anymore. It's not bringing you a return. And then on a corporate level, it's like, oh, this isn't bringing a return. We have to pivot. We have to pivot to something more sustainable, or we have to make whole changes to our production processes. And it's something that we can all influence again. And it's dope because people are going to advocate for, just like you said, your partner is getting you to think about it. We have a bunch of climate communicators now on social media across so many different industries that are getting people to think about it. I'm getting producers and TV, film, and events to think about it. It's like it's happening naturally, and it sucks that it's the worst catastrophes that are going to get everybody on board. You know, where it's like, well, it's undeniable now. The tornadoes are here, the ice age is here, whatever it is. It's like now, but at that point that happens, all that we'll be left with is how we can creatively navigate that. Well, it's interesting. I was just watching this person actually talk about how intelligence comes down to plasticity, how you can take new information, um, how you can take new information and use new frameworks to reach a new result. That is what intelligence is, and that's what set us apart as humans. And it sucks that that is that's really driven by necessity. Uh, but I'm also happy to see that there's a lot of people that are doing the work to that it's going to take before it becomes an absolute necessity. It's also still moving at a really slow pace because every single year they say, "Hey, we're getting closer and closer," and I don't think that we're seeing the efforts ramp up at the same speed, but the efforts are increasing, and I am hopeful that we can steer ourselves towards a protopia instead of dystopia.
Yeah. I think it's not going to be some miraculous thing. I've had plenty of conversations with people who are like, "Oh, there's just going to be some technology will come along and it'll just fix it." I don't think this is going to be a technological solution. I think it's going to be individual by individual, one conversation at a time. Even as slow as that is, I think that's the only way. But we'll see.
Technology on a global scale isn't sustainable in and of itself. So any technology that could be developed to handle a global issue in and of itself isn't going to be sustainable. You know,
Right.
it's just not possible. It's like, it's like the laws of entropy at that point. It's just not possible.
Mm-hmm. Can you share? You were on a panel discussion up in San Francisco for Earth Day. You had an interaction with somebody on stage afterwards after you made a comment about Palestine. Can you share about that? Because I think it kind of ties into where this conversation is going.
Yeah, definitely. We live in a polarizing world now where, like what you mentioned, like if I say, oh, the climate's changing, there's always going to be somebody that's like, oh, it's not, that's what I did, and somebody's going to be offended by it. Um, and in this case, I was at the California Academy of Sciences on a panel where we were speaking about, environmental issues, how to encourage the younger generation to even participate in mitigation. And towards the end, there was a Q&A where uh, a guest asked, because during the conversation, we were talking a lot about essentially land reclamation, how it's important that we allow the indigenous communities that are part or that grew and that come from the land to have stewardship of the land, and how deviating from that led us to a lot of the problems that we have now, like with California fire season and the mismanagement of the forest, stuff like that. So we were talking about that type of stuff. And so somebody brought up at the end, they said, well, are our efforts at land reclamation ending only here in the US, or do we ever see any of ourselves doing work outside of the US to help in reclamation efforts? And they specifically said a couple of places in Palestine. Um, and there was kind of an awkward moment on stage where nobody really wanted to address it. I didn't have a microphone in my hand.
I know. I saw the video.
So I kind of just like looked at each other again because it's a hot topic. There's
Mm-hmm.
100 plus people there in this planetarium that we're speaking in, and so I reached for the microphone, and I just had to start off by saying, firstly, free Palestine, right? Because that just needs to be said in every room across every platform. Um, and we have to shed light on what's occurring there, because it's not just a humanitarian crisis, but at the root of it is that same let's say colonization and removal of indigenous cultures from land that we find ourselves here now dealing with. And we're trying to find these ways to come back from it generations later, while there's people currently dealing with it happening to them right now. And so I brought all this stuff up, and it seemed like it was well received by the audience. But at the end of it, we encouraged the audience members to come to the stage, say hello, ask any further questions. And this gentleman just rushed the stage, and I was looking over, it's like a happy moment. It was great. Everybody's like clapping. I'm like, hey, we know that. It was a really great talk. I learned so much from the other panelists. I'm just like looking over, and next thing I know, I have this guy in between my legs pointing his finger in my face, like, you don't know what the F you're talking about. You need to watch what you need to watch what you're saying. Da, da, da. And it just caught me off guard. It completely caught me off guard. I just wasn't expecting it. I didn't know what he was talking about at first. And I was like, kind of like, what are you talking about? First I was like, you need to take a step back. What are you upset about? Let's have a conversation. He said, free Palestine. You don't even know what that means. I'm like, I don't know what it means. I'm talking about the genocide that's occurring there. What do you think it means? And he's like, automatically, he just starts going into Hamas, starts talking about Hamas. I'm like, hold on. Let's talk about the people there right now that are being killed, the overwhelming majority being women and children. What do you think about that? And he's like, he's like, you don't know, back when Hamas put this in their charter and all this stuff. And I'm like, yo, if we can't even have a conversation that centers human beings that are being killed and removed from their land, then we can't have a conversation. Then I know that this is so far past the conversation if we can't agree on even the basic human rights at this point. And he was becoming agitated. His wife was starting to argue with some of the other people around, and the Cal Academy team fortunately came and was super protective of me, and we're ushering him out of the space. And luckily it didn't, escalate past that. And again, like once he was removed, like the overwhelming majority of people that came down to stage were, supportive, protective, and were, congratulating all of us on an incredible talk throughout the whole entire night, which was great. And the chief officer of philanthropy at Cal Academy reached out to me. A lot of the directors emailed me and were talking about the incident, saying like, "Oh, we appreciate how much grace you showed during that." I'm like, it's at the end of the day, it's not even about me. It's about you maybe using my platform to say this thing about these people that are going through something right now, because their experience is so deeply connected to my experience. And my experience, the bulk of the things that I deal with on a daily basis now when it comes to mental, even physical health and stuff like that, it's because at a certain point, me and my community were completely disconnected and removed from our land, I'm immigrating here, but removed and disconnected from our land and from our birthright, from our connection to nature and to connection to the natural spaces that we belonged in, and then put through horrible systems that stripped away our humanity. And I'm not going to sit by and be silent while other communities face that, thinking like, oh, well, we have our own problems here, or, there's other issues, or I don't want to upset the donors. Like, no, like F all of that. Like, we're gonna talk about it, and we're gonna scream that from every rooftop that we can, because free Palestine.
Yeah, it was. I'd watched one of your stories after that, and it was one point in specific that you made that you brought up again, which is like, if we can't focus the conversation on the humanity of the people involved in this, then I don't know what we're doing. And it's bizarre how disconnected so much of the conversation around that is, where there's a lot of political talking points. I was at a pro-Palestine protest last night down in Tempe, mostly just stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, but also just because it was kind of the start of the invasion of Rafah. And it was just kind of bizarre to see where on the side of the street is completely peaceful. Police didn't bother us. It was fine. It's not what would be portrayed in the news probably. But like the cars driving by, probably an equal amount of people honking in support, another equal amount giving us the finger as they went by, and then the majority of people not acknowledging it, which I think is very representative of kind of everything that's happening right now, where some people are very vocal for and against. A lot of people aren't saying anything. And it's just strange that you can't have a conversation around the fact that there's a lot of people dying, most of which, like, to consider this like a war scenario is not accurate anymore, right? It's just so many women and children dying, aid workers, people in hospitals. It's just a really bizarre scenario where people can't acknowledge the humanity of the situation, which is why I wanted to ask you about that, because I think you had a very succinct response when you were kind of recapping what had happened with what happened in San Francisco.
Yeah, it's definitely enough to strip away at the hope that we all have that we can move towards a fulfilling, thriving, safe world. That again, like, it's the doctrine of certain systems to dehumanize people in an attempt to humanize other people. And it's kind of like what I was saying earlier about Black Mammoth Gardens and the work there to create a three-dimensional image of who we are. Because again, there were people that needed to create a one-dimensional image of who we are um, to validate what they were doing to who we are, you know? And the same thing is occurring in Palestine. They're up against the same system that has us all depressed and down and isolated right now and disconnected. And the only way that we fight back is to get reconnected. And that's not just to nature, it's to all, it's to each other. It's to understand. And because now everything is on a global scale, we also have to look at ourselves as a global community, and be able to navigate on a much larger scale. So I, for my neighbors on that global community scale, the same basic humanity that I afford my neighbor downstairs, who's this old man that I got to help him, figure out, how to deal with internet providers and stuff like that. It's once we start extending that basic humanity to our neighbors on a global scale, we'll start to see better results in general. And I question anybody that can't do that, or especially people that are like, I can't do that because of retaliation, in the name of retaliation.
I feel like, kind of like with your story earlier about that old lady and just so many of these things, exposure kind of seems to be a common theme, I guess, through this conversation, where it feels like so much of this is due to a lack of exposure, and where you're not exposed to something, you generally have fear around it. And a lot of that's deliberate, like you've mentioned. But I just wish there was a way to kind of expose people to more parts of the world and to more people to understand, like, these people aren't your enemy. They're not coming for you. They're not going to come to subjugate you. That's largely a white phenomenon. But that's like a big fear of like, oh, if we don't hold these people down, they're going to take over and subjugate us. I'm like, that's just kind of that's largely something that's been a European and a white thing, an American thing. I guess to start wrapping up, do you have an ask for the listeners today? We've kind of covered a lot, and I think a lot of this has been probably outside the normal theme of what my show's been about, but I've really appreciated the conversation so far. Do you have an ask for people listening?
Yeah, touch grass.
Yeah.
Get outside, touch grass, but more importantly, engage with your community, uh, especially if you can do that creatively, if you can do that in playful ways. Realize that you're part of a larger community, and by being an active participant, you not only heal yourself, reconnect, but you might actually help somebody else heal and reconnect. And I think that's part of the largest work that we can all be doing as individuals. Is de-emphasizing the individual and coming back to community, coming back to each other, realizing that humanity in general, it's a large community. And if we support each other and question the systems that seek to disempower us, then I think that we'll start to head in a direction that we can all really just enjoy. Like we live on a beautiful planet that literally grows the food we need to eat. It provides things for us to drink. It's freaking beautiful out there, and we've allowed some people to create systems that have us check in our credit score every day, or So again, it's like we can build like a better, beautiful world that brings us fulfillment and joy on this plane of existence that we all find ourselves on, and we can do that starting off in the communities surrounding us, and then we can start to lean on the systems in place to make those changes as well, because we'll just stop engaging with them on every level, financially, through communication, whatever it is, and we'll reclaim our power that way.
Yeah, I think it's even like an identity point too, right? Where people identify with these systems as, largely in America. And I certainly suffered from this of like so identifying with what I did. Like that was so much of who I am, right? And I'm still trying to like kind of unpack that. So yeah, I think there's something about thoughts become actions, actions become habits, habits become identity, something along those lines. So yeah, I think also another thing I wanted to bring up from previous conversation is the idea of influencing change. I'm always like, what's the action to take? What do we do from here? And again, this was circling around social determinants of health, where I'm like so often like, what can I do to help drive this forward? And this is a woman who works in the healthcare system in this space. And she was saying mostly where we are right now, unfortunately, is from a stage of moving people from pre-contemplation to contemplation. It's like still at the point of getting people aware of the problem before we can even start addressing actions to solve the problem. So I think a lot of what we talked about today, I think not for everyone, hopefully a lot of people listening aren't in the stage where a lot of this was new to them. But for anyone who is, hopefully this may have helped move people from pre-contemplation to contemplation and exposing them to some new thoughts and ideas. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that up. I feel like it might be a nice way to round things out.
That's a huge one. And that there's a third piece that comes after that. It's the action, because I'm telling you, be seen doing the thing, that in and of itself, it's enough to inspire other people. When other people see you doing this thing that's bringing you joy, that's bringing you connection, it inspires them to also go out and do it. And then ultimately somebody else sees them doing it. And it's just this beautiful ripple effect, this beautiful domino effect of being seen. Again, it's like what I said with the Black Men with Gardens. Once other Black men start to see Black men working with flowers, working with plants, doing these things, they're like, I know what I'm doing this weekend. I'm going to go and buy some new plants. Like, oh, I'm going to do this. And that we have to realize the power that we have and the small actions that we take on a daily basis. And there's people that are going to see you taking those actions, and they're going to be inspired. You're inspiring people that you have no idea are inspired by you.
Well, Nelson, I think you're a very inspiring figure. And I really appreciate you kind of coming on and spending 90 minutes with me and kind of sharing everything you did today. Seriously, I really appreciate everything you've had to say and sharing this time with me. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor. Thank you for the platform to just speak my mind.
Hey everyone, that's all for today's show. I want to thank you so much for stopping by and watching, especially if you've made it all the way to this point. If you'd like to be notified when new episodes are going to be released, feel free to subscribe and make sure you hit the bell button as well. To learn more about today's guest, feel free to look in the description. You can also visit the podcast website, which is exploringhealthpodcast.com. That website will also be linked in the description. As always, likes, shares, comments are a huge help to me and to this channel and to the show. So any of that you can do, I would really appreciate. And again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.